Burkina Faso, as much as 40% of Burkina Faso's territory is not even under the control of the government. My parents never owned a landline phone. When I started living on my own, I've never owned a landline phone. It was there at that time in Liberia. Liberia has never recovered fully. It was there in the Sahel region after Libya collapsed. The Sahel region has not recovered. Burkina Faso, as much as 40% of Burkina Faso's territory is not even under the control of the government because of that conflict in the Sahel region.
Right.
So why am I talking about all these things? Imagine a child of 12 years old who is just getting into their preteens. Yet they keep being deprived of food that is rightfully theirs. Yet their growth keeps being interfered by external players. This child will end up with stunted growth. This child will end up with psychological trauma. And that, in a sense, speaks to what Africa is undergoing. We are still trying to rebuild after that colonial interference that lasted for several decades. We're still trying to rebuild after the slave trade that lasted for several centuries. But even today, as I speak to you, there's all this external interference that makes it very difficult for us to even be able to strengthen the African Union. However, there is hope. Why I believe strongly there's hope, a couple of years back when Paul Kagame was the chairman of the African Union, he proposed an import tax as a way of funding the African Union so that it is not reliant on donations from the European Union or the nations from China. Unfortunately, that has not materialized. But that is another example of a very pragmatic solution that should either be revised or explored further so that the African Union can have sufficient funding. And with sufficient funding from Africa itself, people like me, people like you in the diaspora, we can be able to then demand, if my taxes are going to go towards strengthening and revamping the African Union, then I'm going to demand of the African Union that you cannot just exist there as a mini United Nations. You must now play a pivotal role in ushering in peace on this continent. After all, the African Union is but a representative of African nations. So as long as the African Union will not be funded by Africans, Africans will not feel like they have a stake at what is happening there. But the other thing that you and I must do, and we are doing it, thankfully, we're not just dreaming about it, we're doing it, is to educate one another on these matters so that the size of the fight in the dog can keep getting bigger. Because the more Africans know what is at stake, the more they'll be like, wait a minute, we are much stronger together than apart. And then all these philosophical arguments and theoretic arguments of do we want a United States of Africa molded after the United States of America, or do we want more of the European Union thing, that will fall by the wayside as we simply seek to find solutions to the fact that we need to travel across Africa, and to do so we need peace. We need fufu from Nigeria to easily be sold to be cooked and prepared in Nairobi, Kenya, and ugali in Kenya to be cooked in Liberia, in West Africa, to exchange our cuisine, to exchange our cultures, you know. Those are the practical matters that as Africans wake up to the reality of what should happen, then we will make demands, and then nobody can stop our voice.
I really like that. And I believe you touch up on one of the burning question within me, which was you talk about the Pan-African Scholarship, for instance, which was put in place by Muammar Gaddafi. But that you can only access that, of course, once you get to the university level. And we know that the vast majority of African are not, only very few get to that university level, but there has to be another program from the ground up to prepare the young ones to get up to that level and be able to access that. Now, and I think as great as it is, I feel like maybe for those of us that are older, getting older, it may be a little, unless unless our desire is to learn and be re-educated on certain things, but it might just be over for us because, as mentality, we're very set in our ways. But for the young, how do we, as African, create this program and make it, not just create the program so that it's fancy and I can go on the website and read it, but how do we make it accessible? First, we create the program for the young to prepare them for the future so that they can get to that university level and decide what they want to do. So that's my first part. How do we create it? What program do we put in place? How do we do that? And also, 70% of Africans are youths. When I went to Ivory Coast, all the police that I saw on the street were young boys, young people. I'm talking 19, 20. They're just, all young.
Yeah.
On top of that, we have a whole schools of populations of young Africans that are also, we're not very good with our hands. We don't have any, maybe I'm wrong, but my observation as it stands, we don't have any trade skills to compete on the international global level. And so when we talk about developing Africa, most of the time we rely on external sources, China and of that likeness, to come in and develop our country. And what do? They come in and give our people, our young people, bare minimum how to do certain things, because it doesn't take that much to give them the basic information and pay them $3 a day, $4 a day, whatever that amount come to, depending on the region that you're in. So what do we need to do? Does Africa need to do to prepare the young people? And yeah, and I will leave it at that. Just those two questions. The first being, what program do we put in place to prepare the young? And how does Africa handle its growing young population and preparing them to become builders, to become workers that would build the infrastructures of Africa? Because we can't always rely on external sources. It's hurting us and not doing us any good. I come in there, I set up a country, I hire a bunch of young people, pay them $4 a day. It doesn't even begin to tap into my profit margin. Instead, I just make a whole lot of money.
Yeah, great questions. And it's a great way to wrap up. Now, I'm going to illustrate the first answer this way. My parents never owned a landline phone. When I started living on my own, I've never owned a landline phone. Now, imagine a situation where currently somebody starts this huge campaign to ensure that every household in Nairobi, in Kampala, in Liberia, in Lagos, that every household needs to have a landline phone for better communication. You see, that will be like the worst exercise in futility, because we don't need them now. Why I mentioned that is Africa leapfrogged the landline phone by moving from people having absolutely no phones, moving from landline being for the select few, the few rich in the society, to countries like Kenya, where, almost everybody has a smartphone, not just a phone, but a smartphone. And that completely revolutionized communication and made the goal of people having landline phones in their homes completely obsolete. Now, I mentioned that to explain that the same is true of education, formal education as we know it.